coming on and for everybody's interest in this area. It's not probably the most common area of feminist inquiry, but I think it's really absolutely essential to the way that we struggle to demand a more just global economic system that advances women's rights. And of course, it's not in the interests of those who set the rules for the feminist discussion to be focused in this area. And we know that in the last few years, there is a resurgence in a feminist movement, but there's also a resurgence in a sort of neoliberal, perhaps, feminist approach. And so this is a unique opportunity to come together collectively across a number of countries. All our speakers are in different countries, and really think about how we analyse the dominant rules that are impacting on women's rights, and also how we move to resist, to reshape a global economic order. My name is Kate Lappin. I work for Public Services International, which is a global union federation, and it represents 30 million workers who are delivering public services. I'm also very proud to be a former regional coordinator of APWLD, and I have to, acknowledge that a lot of the work I've done in the past in relation to trade and women's human rights has been through my time at APWLD. And we have 4 speakers who are going to cover different aspects of trade, the impact of trade agreements on women's human rights, with a particular focus on the current regional trade agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that is what was supposed to be finalised at the end of this, or earlier this year, but is now going through another process potentially of negotiation, and has been for several years. Of course, with the RCEP, we don't know exactly what's in the current version of the RCEP, because as all trade agreements, or as those that have been negotiated in this region, have been secretive, and we don't have the text. But I think our panellists can take a fairly educated guess at what's in there, either through public statements of the negotiators who have indicated what chapters are still being considered, what provisions within those chapters are still being considered, sometimes with leaks, but also with looking at previous negotiations and what's been the content of, for example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, or some of the preferential trade agreements from the region and elsewhere. Of course, it's a time where the global trade rules are really fundamental in the way that the region is playing a role in the geopolitical space globally. But I think our panellists might explore a little bit more about the narratives that are being missed out. So we're being offered ways to think about the global trade negotiations as either the protectionism of the big economies, the big imperialist economies, or about a kind of a multilateralism that they also defined, but very rarely about a trade justice perspective. And so I think this is a very timely webinar for us to think a little bit more about what are the problems with the current trade negotiations, as well as what are the opportunities, or what are the alternatives to the current trade regime that we've been, that countries are negotiating. So the 4 speakers that we have will cover slightly different aspects of the trade rules and their impacts on women's rights. And then, as the 4 are all experts in the area, will take questions from anybody that's, either on their areas that they've been discussing, or also on more broadly the the current state of trade and the impact on women's human rights. So I'm going to kick off with some of the speakers. What we will do is make sure that they leave time for discussion. So I have to sort of warn everybody that unlike a physical panel where you can kind of quietly nudge somebody about they're going over time, you have to be a little bit more rude in these and speak over them. So we're going to try and give each of them about 8 minutes to talk about their areas, and then I think that should allow for us to have a good understanding of their main arguments and then go into discussion. I'm going to start off first, moving to Anita. Yep, Anita from IT for Change, who has been doing a work on the trade rules relating to the e-commerce provisions within trade agreements, but also more broadly around the way that trade agreements have impacted on women's capacity to organise, particularly in the informal sector. She's based in India, and of course we know that India is key to these negotiations, that they've withdrawn from the RCEP, and that any capacity we have to mobilise, to provide critiques in India are really essential to trying to block the detrimental trade agreements. I think Anita can give us quite a unique perspective, and I'll hand over to her.
Hi, Kate, and hi, everybody. Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. What I request is that colleagues from APWLD start off with my slides so that we can, without much ado, kick off and leave time for discussion. So I am waiting in anticipation of my slides. Yes. All right. Thank you so much. So I will focus particularly on the regional agreement that is currently nearly negotiated. And as Kate mentioned, India withdrew at the last stages of the RCEP recently. And I will put the spotlight on how digital trade provisions really impact women's rights. Next slide. What I'm going to do is just cover these broad points, which are what is changing for global trade rules in the digital economy. Obviously, digital technologies have changed a lot, and they've changed the everyday lives, they've changed the way economies are organized, and obviously they've changed political struggles. But what becomes very important is that in a context where multilateral rules are consistently playing catch up with phenomena in society, and when multilateral negotiations oftentimes are about the political economy of North-South relationships, the vacuum in rules or rule making invariably tends to affect the global South in very pernicious ways. So I will be focusing a little bit on what the digital economy is doing to global trade rules. Then talk a little bit about how trade provisions or digital trade provisions in the RCEP concern gender justice. I will briefly touch on a couple of examples so that it's quite evident how proposed provisions in the RCEP may be seen to have far-reaching consequences for the realities of women particularly from marginal sections and located at the margins of the economy. And I will also very, very briefly, weigh in on whether India did the right thing by pulling out of the RCEP. Next slide. So the digital economy. The digital economy is obviously something that we experience in our being, doing, and in our varied selves, philosophical to the most material. And what is really happening is that in technical terms, through the pervasive platformization of the everyday, we are actually seeing a shift even in the way in which trade takes place. What we are actually seeing is that digital trade is not just about online marketplaces. They're not just places where you buy and sell, but it is actually a new way in which production systems are getting recast. So this may be seen as a larger structural transformation of the economy itself, in a way in which not just online marketplaces, but all kinds of economic activities begin to acquire the flavor and the modalities of platforms, which is why it's often believed that we live in a platform era or in the platform economy. The crucial thing, which of course is going to be a decisive force in the way in which all trade rules are going to be governed in the future, is the idea of data, big data, and artificial intelligence, which is completely transforming all kinds of ways by which production systems are responding. So it's essentially a disruption to the way in which production and distribution takes place and to the entire value chain of the way in which sectors are organized. Today, data-based intelligence residing primarily in the global north and also with China enables a control of production systems. Next slide. So in respect of global trade rules, what we need to understand is that platformization, since platformization disrupts the way production systems are organized, trade rules as they exist don't really hold. However, what we actually see is that these rules seem to be invoked regardless. In the blurring of the lines between how rules for services and rules for goods operate, we actually see that the rhetoric is used to the advantage of the global north. There is a complexification and there is a certain confusion and flux in the way in which commitments under the GATS somehow translate into this new era where the advent of data has transformed the way value chains operate. In this kind of transformation, the North seems to assume a de facto liberalization of technology services, and the extent of liberalization of digital services that the South would ideally like to retain control over is something that we see is not at all on the table for negotiations. Next slide. So let me take farming as an example, and Kartini will speak about it a bit more. What we see is from the way in which soil quality to the way in which produce is sold in the market, technology intervenes in the farming supply chain in many, many ways. So you have IoT, you have drones, you have sensors, you have GPS, and then you have fintech solutions, you have logistics, you have online e-tail, and you have data analytics. All of these things involve different kinds of technologies, including blockchain and data. And for the global South, there is a very big question. Does this imply that is the advent of these technological services, database services, does this imply that the commitments that these countries have made under GATS for liberalization can be stretched to things like drones, to things like driverless trucks? Or for instance, when you talk about P2P lending and fintech, should the rules of liberalization for financial services be stretched also to P2P lending, which essentially involves digital platforms? Next slide. This is something that I already mentioned, that competitive advantage in global trade is shaped by de facto digital trade rules. And what we see is that every country must have the space to decide what to liberalize, to what extent, at what pace. And countries should have the ability to govern their data as a strategic economic resource, so that what can flow freely, how much, and what cannot flow, and what can be localized is a call that domestic policymakers can actually make in order to prevent the rampant extractivism of data, which is posing to be the new question for colonization. However, we see that the real politic of this is that US and China are really the two hegemons controlling this part of digital trade. And it almost seems like you have to make a choice between the US and China in the future in terms of a new kind of a bipolarity in the world. Next slide. So I'm just going to quickly say, Kate has already mentioned that we really don't know what's in the text of the RCEP, but if we were to extrapolate from what we already know from TPP and now the CPTPP, we can actually see 4 broad areas which become very, very significant. Two of them are older areas and two of them are newer areas. The first one is customs duties and the ability of developing countries to use these tariffs as an instrument to generate revenues so that it can actually use it for redistributional functions. It can use it for creating the care economy infrastructure. The RCEP provisions, supposedly, from leaked text, we know that the RCEP provisions ban customs duties on digital products and services. It's also worthwhile noting that the raw material for 3D comes predominantly from the United States. So, which basically means that one will have to be dependent on the United States. And if you're not able to levy tariffs and duties, then you're not able to really capitalize on the digital economy or check the harms that might happen to your domestic economy. The second is there is a prohibition on source code disclosure or location of computing facilities, which basically means that regardless of what algorithms may be used by these companies, governments cannot scrutinize these algorithms to see if there is any gaming or any anti-competitive practices. The third is a requirement for cross-border transfer of information, which basically means unregulated data flows, and simply data cannot be harnessed as a resource which can help smaller units, which can help women's economic empowerment, the economic empowerment of the economy at large. The fourth is the national treatment of service suppliers, which basically means that you cannot take affirmative action or have quotas, for instance, on online spaces like marketplaces. You can't say that you will have to have preferential treatment for certain organizations, certain MSMEs, which are operated by women. Next slide. So I'd like to just take a quick couple of examples and not more than a couple of minutes, Kate, so before I hear you. So the next slide. So the first example I'd like to take is, how do these provisions directly impinge on women's rights, or how could they potentially impinge on women's rights? So with a lot of fanfare, last year Alibaba launched the EWTP, the E-World Trade Platform. And at the launch of this platform, Jack Ma actually said that he's fed up of the WTO and that corporations of the world, along with the citizens of the world, should actually be running global trade. And at that meeting, subsequent to that meeting, it was actually proposed that Malaysia should enter this EWTP, and ostensibly this was because the small and medium segments of enterprises could benefit, and there could be an exchange between Malaysian and Chinese firms in terms of trade facilitation, logistics, and all of that. But the reality is that it is a double whammy, and already we have Malaysian entrepreneurs, talking in the media that the e-service platform is more open to Chinese medium-sized firms. No surprises here, which basically means that Malaysian vendors are facing tougher competition. But this is not all. The worst thing is that all the data actually goes to Alibaba, and all the intelligence that operates within the EWTP, whether it's Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, or any country that's participating on the platform, basically go away to Alibaba. So this tends to be controlled by a private corporation, and it inhibits the right of countries like Malaysia to build their own homegrown digital infrastructure, whether public digital infrastructure or also infrastructure that may be utilized, data infrastructure that may be utilized by smaller firms. Next slide. Data localization requirements were recently relaxed in Indonesia because obviously Indonesia is going to be signing up for the RCEP, and therefore they made changes to their domestic law, and they started limiting it only to public services. So where there will be an implication for data on public services, there they will retain the right to localize data. But what we actually see is that this really presents a kind of a moment where all the fintech companies, several hundreds of them, have had to shut down the last year because many of them were engaged in what the economy likes to call moral hazards, which basically means something that's not good for public interest and certainly something that's terrible for women's interests. These P2P lending platforms used to be taking collaterals, which were in the form of nude pictures of female students who used to be borrowing on these platforms. So there was a crackdown on all these. And so guess what? Chinese fintech companies want to move across and they want to enter Indonesia. If Indonesia does not have the right to impose local presence requirements, how can these new markets be regulated to protect vulnerable borrowers like students, vulnerable borrowers who may not have any property or collateral? So next slide. This is my last example. This is something that Kartini will speak about in greater detail, but I wanted to say that as agriculture becomes more and more about services in agriculture, database services, sensors, drones, soil testers, automated machines which collect, and farms are going to have no farmers, you're actually seeing the hold that Alibaba is having over the entire region, entire Asia Pacific region. Recently, they've got into the business of dairy farms and set up a blockchain between New Zealand and Beijing so that early in the morning, Beijingers can enjoy organic milk directly sourced from New Zealand farms. And this basically means that in this entire ambiguity around what is a service, what is not a service, what can I regulate, Chinese companies cannot be prevented from acquiring farmland in the whole region because you have to provide national treatment of service suppliers. What does this mean for smallholder women farmers in the region is a question that, of course, all of us know is a moot point. Next. This is my last slide. And of course,
got to bring Kartini in.
Yeah, all right. So do you want me to weigh in on RCEP or should I come in later on if I've taken more time?
Is this your last slide? Or
it is my last slide. This is my last slide. All right. Sorry, Kate. Well, we can discuss this later as well. I mean, India's decision to opt out from the RCEP was driven by, I think, the power of people's movement. There is absolutely no two ways about it. I think we should really be proud of ourselves as people struggles. We have managed to do this. India was afraid of import flooding from China, but it is also afraid that farmers there will just be the entire electorate and polity will be up against them. But also, I think India has its eye on data sovereignty and nationalization of data. We can discuss this a little bit more later on. And this produces new concerns for the feminist movements. And of course, I think we will have to bring in radical thoughts into all our struggles, and there is no either or about it. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Anita. I think this is such a new area for everybody. Of course, we weren't even aware that there was an e-commerce chapter in the TPP or the CPTPP until pretty much it had been negotiated. So there was a fairly limited analysis, not just from feminists, but from the broader movement until quite recently. And the implications are enormous, as you've mentioned. It's not just what we might traditionally think of as digital platforms, but really increasingly encompasses every possible element of both the economy, but even more broadly of public services. And I think there's probably, if we were going to come to the end of this and have more focused webinars on specific areas, this is one that I'm sure everybody would like to hear more about. So if anybody would like to start putting questions in the Q&A box for Anita, we'll come back to some of what she's discussed. But I think it's apt that we move to Kartini, who will speak a little bit more about the agricultural market access and the implications for women in the agricultural sector, some of which was raised by Anita, that increasingly that's also part of a digital economy, but there are broad implications, I think, and in the region, particularly a lot of small-scale farmers being women, it's possibly one of the largest areas that will impact on women. So I'll hand over to Kartini, but also please, if anybody has questions that they've been thinking about since with Anita's presentation, start putting them into the box so we don't forget them. Kartini, are you able to?
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Hey. Thanks, Kate, and also thanks, Anita, for very interesting presentations on the e-commerce chapters. So I'm Kartini Samon. I'm from Grain. We've been pretty much working and looking into free trade agreements through the lens of agriculture and food system. And I would just to connect what Kate was said in the beginning, that this is sort of like a timely discussions, because everywhere we're seeing the rise of neoliberal policies. Although in the good news is the resistance against it is also increasing. But many of these neoliberal policies are pushed through free trade agreements that increase pressure against women's rights, but as well as their living space and their livelihood. And FTA itself has become a tool for corporations, including agribusiness and food retail that Anita mentioned, to expand their operations across borders and continents by changing national laws and regulations that then provide stronger rights for corporations. New generations of FTAs like RCEP goes beyond the old trade rules. So it's not just simply regulating export or import anymore, but it becomes a powerful corporate rights agreement that gives a huge privilege actually for transnational companies, and it even deprive government from their own sovereignty in terms of determining what government allowed or not allowed to do in the context of regulations. And so those clauses under this new, we call it the new era, the new generations of FTAs are shrinking policy space, but also shrinking women's rights. And I would like to sort of in this opportunity to try unpack a little bit some of the problematic chapters or provisions under RCEP that affects food and agriculture and rural women in particular. So there's no specific agriculture chapter within RCEP. So it is very important to read in as far as we can get, understanding also lesson learned from other similar FTAs like TPP. So for example, I will start to look in one particular is the IP chapter of RCEP. So historically, many of the RCEP member countries are, biodiversity rich countries. You have Indonesia, you have China, you have India there. And over the period of many years, scientists, mostly from Western countries and large multinational companies, are taking this rich biodiversity, tweak them and patent them. So the TRIPS Plus provisions under the IP chapter of RCEP are pushes for stricter rules on intellectual property rights. It gives longer patent terms over 25 years. And also there's part of what's called the IP enforcement with criminal punishment for infringement, even if it's only for personal use. So this provisions is actually neglecting, but also eliminate rural women's knowledge of seeds, of biodiversity, of traditional medicines. And many of the RCEP member countries are still agriculture-based countries. As 3.5 billion people will be affected by RCEP. Almost 500 million of it are small-scale farmers, and many of it are women. So in the context of the world we are living today, it will be catastrophic actually to restrict women's and farmers, farmers on the activity of seed saving and seed exchange, especially under extreme pressure of climate change, for example, when farmers need more diversity in the fields rather than less. So this is one provisions that also sort of shrinking the rights of women, the right of farmers in protecting their traditional knowledge and understanding of and biodiversity. So the other one is, which I find it interesting also, Anita mentioned, is the national treatment. National treatment was included in both the RCEP investment and service chapter, as far as we know from leaked text. That so the national treatments stated that every country must treat the multinational corporations as equal as domestic companies. And so for countries of the member countries, unless they make special exceptions when they sign RCEP, so countries like Indonesia or Philippines or Thailand or even Japan, which until now have restrict foreigners' ability to buy farmland, will no longer be able to do so. And member countries will have to open land market to all these investors without restrictions. And why is it also included in service chapter? Because as Anita mentioned, farmers now often see, especially precision farming or digital agriculture, are seen as services. And so they have to be included either direct land market or indirect. Indirect in the sense, for example, you can do remote farming, and that happened in the case of Japan and Vietnam, for example. So you have companies, agriculture companies, operate from Japan, their land in Vietnam, without being actually present. And that was also linked to the context of local presence of corporations, which many, I remember it's included in the e-commerce chapter that there's a specific clause that says that no need for local presence. And why? It's because there's an increasing growth of platform economy, as Anita already mentioned in the beginning. And they don't want to be present legally or where the country they operate. So it's easier for them. And so this is this particular provisions actually sort of making it more vulnerable for women in rural area, because women often don't have access to land due to both cultural or legal norms. And such clause will make rural women more vulnerable and potentially lose access to their livelihood. And also worth to mention that actually women land rights defenders are among the most vulnerable under violent attack, like physical violent attacks. So this we need to put that in considerations as well, how opening up for bigger potential of land grabbing or land market will have implications to women. The other two, just quickly, yeah, Kate?
Okay.
Am I running out of time?
Go ahead with if you've got a final point.
Okay, so quickly, one is, the other is the standstill and ratchet. I think I need to mention this as well, is that this provisions that's not even mentioned in any chapter, but in the annex, where government have to freeze the current level of liberalizations. I think just giving example that maybe the next speaker, Ari, will talk more is, for example, if government grants water management to foreign private companies, and there are complaints to return it to under state management. So if they're signed to RCEP, it's not possible to do the otherwise. You cannot go in backwards. So because several countries, including Indonesia, as I speak from Indonesia as well, they already put so much liberalizations on private, including like water services for irrigations, for drinking water, and like signing on RCEP will sort of lock in that level of liberalizations. I think sort of quickly, so this is sort of a question for everyone, I think, where the women's rights are being placed or under considerations in RCEP. From what we've seen, what we heard, so it's rather stripping off women's rights and advancing corporate rights. So I think it is very important, and why women's movement or women's in various sectors are working against these free trade agreements. So I'll stop at that if there's further questions later on. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kartini. Yes, I think this is a really important and one of the most critical areas of the agreement is the market access for agriculture, and perhaps later we could come back to the discussion We know that India partly withdrew because of the pressure in relation to market access for dairy, and that dairy, the provision of dairy in India is predominantly women through cooperatives. And I think that's an extraordinary outcome, that a cooperative, of course, one of the largest cooperatives in the world, of many women, were able to pressure otherwise neoliberal government to withdraw. So that's at least one part of a good news story. But I think that the issues you raised around the ratchet provisions, the standstill provisions, are particularly relevant to public services. The potential to regulate public services, you mentioned water as well as others, and that really is relevant to Ari's discussion and the work she's done on protecting or trying to restore the right to access water and other public services in Indonesia. So we'll move on to Ari, but again, if anybody has questions for Kartini, please put them in the box so we can come back to that discussion. Over to you, Ari.
Thank you, Kate, and hello, everyone. My name is Ari. I work with Solidaritas Perempuan, Women's Solidarity for Human Rights, member organization of APWLD. So the trade agreements like the RCEP are actually designed to make it easier for foreign TNCs to invest and doing business. In doing so, they put the rights of citizens and women second to profits. The previous speakers already unpacked the problematic clauses on some chapters of RCEP. I will try to elaborate this on the relevance of public and essential services, also its impact to women, just like Kate already mentioned. So I will start with one of example that happens in the capital city of my country, Jakarta. So Jakarta water privatization is an example case of the failure of public-private partnership schemes. So it started with the intervention from the World Bank and will be exacerbated by the trade agreements, including RCEP. After a long struggle, people in Jakarta finally won a great victory when the Supreme Court ordered that Jakarta's water must be returned to the public. The court decided that the human right to water had been violated and that the companies had failed to guarantee an adequate supply of clean, potable water to the city's residents. Even recently, the Supreme Court already annulled the decision, but before that, the government felt afraid to be sued by the companies. The RCEP services takes date August 2015 from the bilaterals.org website embodies the anti-social and anti-democratic essence of these agreements. Services are treated as commercial products that are exchanged for money through markets. There is very narrow view takes precedence over the social, employment, development, even environmental dimensions of services that governments would usually give priority to, or at least treat as equally important when they make and implement policy and law. So what I found out that services chapter of the RCEP would impose at least a severe restriction on the regulatory sovereignty, just like on the Jakarta water privatization case, and policy space of governments with serious social, environmental, cultural, gender, political, and economic consequences. So we talked with the women in Jakarta, so they felt the water services charge very high, but with the very low of quality of water. The market access rule that Kartini also mentioned on the RCEP also requires governments to open and keep open their services markets so that the foreign companies can expand their operations with a very few restrictions. This also means removing restraints on the growth of the service market and access to it by providers of services, even when they are not just targeted at foreign firms. And this is also being very problematic in Indonesia since our re-elected government really eager with the foreign investment, with the foreign companies, and they are not taking learn from the failure of the PPP scheme. So this commitment put handcuffs on the ability of government to shape the provision of services to meet local needs. For instance, a transportation monopoly, a requirement to show an unmet need before opening a new big supermarket, or what do you call it, like the health services, or restriction on the number and size of hotels in a region, for instance, in Bali or in Yogyakarta, or a ban on certain kinds of advertising, just like in the cigarette case, also in Jakarta. And Kartini also mentioned, Kartini and Anita also mentioned about the national treatment role. So it will also impact for the services, because government cannot give preferences to local services and service suppliers, and foreign supplier of services must be treated at least as well as their national counterparts. So this is also being treated for the local, the small and local suppliers of services. However, the recent agreements, including the RCEP, also have an exception that allows subsidies to be limited to the locals. We know that in Indonesia it's very common with the local suppliers, but now they are being treated with this regulation.
Thank you, Ari. I think it's a really good example of applying the rules in a national context around the way that this could undermine the capacity of to bring Jakarta water back into public hands. And this is actually part of the very purpose of trade agreements. The origin of trade agreements was to protect those corporations, multinational corporations, from being held accountable for the kind of exploitation particularly in developing countries. And that's why trade agreements were first negotiated, was to make it impossible to basically kick them out, which is what's happened in Jakarta, is the very clear decision by the Supreme Court that it was a human rights violation to have privatised the water and that it should be returned to public hands. I think, that the particular companies involved have a history in it, so you're right that there is a threat. Some of those companies have sued countries before, and I think there was one case where in Argentina had to try to restore water that wasn't being provided by the private sector, and the tribunal said that, well, yes, water's a human right, but we have to counterbalance human rights against investor rights. And that's the sort of system that is protecting corporations when they've been able to privatise public services. And really the services chapter, I think, is a little bit, as all chapters are, has masked really what it's doing, because almost everything now is a service. Just as Anita said, almost everything is digital, almost everything could be classified as a service. So almost everything would be able to have the right for foreign corporations to move into that sector, including public services. But again, we'll move on and ask Diyana, who's our final speaker, to cover everything else. Basically, Diyana from APWLD is going to talk about what else is there that's hidden, what are the hidden threats of the RCEP, and what we need to be careful about as this trade agreement goes ahead. So Go ahead, Diyana.
Wow. That's a huge task to cover everything else, which unfortunately we haven't got all month to do. But I just wanted to, I'll be expounding on some of the points that both Kartini as well as Ari and Anita and Kate has brought up about how these trade agreements are essentially restricting and limiting the regulatory capacity of states, particularly to actually regulate in our interests, and I will be expanding that by looking at one of the particular elements within the RCEP, specifically the investor state dispute settlement mechanism, ISDS, which is usually found through various provision inside the investment chapter within the RCEP. Now, we know from the secret talks within these secrets negotiations that provision of the ISDS in RCEP is currently being put on hold because of so much resistance from other member states as well, and of course the movements of civil society and peoples across. But it still remains a danger because, number one, there's a very likely possibility that it can come back in a couple of years' time should the RCEP proceed in its current form. And then there's also a likelihood, given that there's all this conversation about trying to bring India back in, and some of these negotiations will continue until next year within the RCEP, that I think because of how secretive the nature of these conversations are, there's no really absolute guarantee that this will remain outside of the RCEP. And so the investor state dispute settlement, just kind of like to roughly quickly describe to people, it's a provision that's commonly found in a lot of bilaterals as well as multilateral investment agreements. You find that in the RCEP, you find them in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, or now they like to call it CPTPP. You'll also find them in a huge number of bilateral investment treaties between two countries. And then you also find them in some, more obscure treaties like the Energy Charter Treaty, for example, which doesn't sound like it has anything to do with investment at all, but is one of the treaties out there that has been really used for a lot of ISDS cases in recent years. And in summary, ISDS mechanism is basically a one-way mechanism that allows for foreign corporations or investor to sue governments in international tribunals. And they can do that without having to go through any kind of domestic legal judiciary system. And they can do that every time they want to claim financial compensation if these corporations feel that their investment, whether direct or indirect, have been adversely impacted by some policies or regulations or new rules that have been introduced by the host government. And usually these arbitrations, these tribunals consist of 3 corporate lawyers, for-profit corporate lawyers, who are usually men, who are usually white, and who are usually either from North America or West Europe. And they are making decisions behind closed doors, away from the public eyes, that have really broad-ranging implications on people's lives, on women, as well as on the planet. And so again, expanding on the point, 2 key points that I wanted to raise here, because we don't have as much time, is to, number one, look at how ISDS has been specifically used to really restrict the regulatory capacity of states. The example on public service is one that both Kate and Ari has also mentioned. So it has been used to really limit government's ability to reverse privatization or regulate any kind of privatization through the use of ISDS cases. We've also seen how ISDS cases have been used to prevent affirmative action policies. And as feminist movements and women's organizations, we believe in in affirmative action policy being one of the key tools, both in CEDAW and the Beijing Declaration Platform for Action, as a means to remedy different kinds of gender inequality. And we've seen an ISDS case in the case of South Africa, when South Africa had introduced an affirmative action law called the Black Empowerment Law, intended to remedy the inequalities that was caused by the apartheid era. And they were subsequently sued over this law, which required 50% representation of Black shareholders within any kind of natural resources company. And consequence to that case, South Africa, they settled it with the investor in this case, but they had to reduce the threshold from 50% to something like 25 to 30%. And then we've also seen, of course, how ISDS has been used to really restrict the ability of government to put together fiscal policies, particularly in relation to taxes, for example. And we know as women, progressive tax measures and tax justice is an integral part of gender justice. That we can't achieve one without the other. And we know that globally, there's about 40 cases that we know of against 24 countries, which are essentially cases that has been filed by corporations who didn't like it when the host country decides to put a tax on a particular transaction or some form of tax evasions. And so when we talk about how we want to see a more just and equitable tax system, it hasn't really been possible for a lot of governments when they try to do that, and they get slapped with a massive ISDS lawsuits. And then, of course, they have also been an example of how ISDS have been used to really restrict the introduction of better labor rules and labor rights. We have the case of Egypt, who was sued by Veolia, which is a French company, when they had increased minimum wage. And this case, along with many other ISDS cases, is a really good example of how even when these corporations don't win an ISDS case, the government never wins them either. Because in this case, Egypt has spent 6 years defending the case, and we know possibly millions of dollars in legal fees, because we do know that statistically an ISDS case costs an average of 8 to 10 millions in terms of legal fees, and that the highest ISDS legal fees that we know of goes up to as high as $30 million US. Which then takes me to my second point. These cases, ISDS, the mechanism, it obviously costs a huge amount of money on taxpayers. It puts a strain on government expenditure as well as budget, both from the damages as well as awards that governments ends up paying when they lose these cases, as well as the legal fees that government actually incur. And this brings me to one major case that had came out recently, where the awards were recently released, and this is particularly the case of Pakistan, who recently lost a case against an Australian incorporated mining company, even though the parent company was nowhere from Australia. And Pakistan has been asked to pay $5.9 billion US as damages to this multinational corporation for having refused a mining license. And this amount is easily more than double the amount that Pakistan actually spends on their healthcare. It's 2% of the country's entire GDP, and it's just 0.1 billion short of the 6 billion loan that Pakistan has now taken from IMF for the next 3 years or so. And when you think about this in the context of any developing countries, and we've seen so many developing countries being sued, and the money and the expenses that could have gone into funding public services that are so important and so relevant for women's human rights, and they are effectively being directed to paying and putting out to large multinational corporations. So these example, and I think the case of Pakistan is a really good point, because this story goes all the way back to 1959, when Pakistan was actually the first country to have signed a bilateral investment treaty with then West Germany in 1959. And if you look at the particular period of time and the context of their time, you notice that that treaty and all the treaty that came after it came at an era, and it essentially was a tool for governments or states that were former colonial, wanting to protect the assets, the investments, and the interests of their corporations who were operating in post-colonial states or newly independent states. Never mind that a lot of those assets and investment were obtained in the course of or through colonialization. And so that is effectively what built this entire, as Kate mentioned, like the origin of this particular ISDS mechanism. And we have 60 years later, it has evolved into this completely undemocratic discriminatory and at the same time in many cases like unnecessary system that is completely biased on the part of the corporations and particularly multinational corporations, and that it has no space whatsoever in any trade agreement, whether it would be RCEP or any other bodies. And I think this is one of both the example within RCEP, and I know a lot of the ongoing conversation in Europe as well and everywhere in the world around ISDS has really shown that the people's movement and mobilization against ISDS is getting some traction in the government, but we know as well at the same time that their responses to it have been inadequate, whether it would be the RCEP or whether it would be the EU's proposal to introduce a multilateral court system, which is just another permanent form of ISDS. And I think we need, by recognizing the origin of the system and where it came from and where it could potentially go, we know that the only way that we can talk about a more just and equitable trade system and regime is to have one that doesn't have any kind of ISDS in it whatsoever. So that's it for me.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Diyana. I mean, I think that's a really important point, that the trade agreements are effectively about cementing and protecting colonial powers or wealth that was accrued through illegitimate means. And Pakistan is a particularly important case. I mean, if we're looking at a country that has some of the lowest gender indicators, and the only way to overcome that is to invest in public health and education, and they have very low revenue, very low corporate taxes and other forms of revenue, and this is effectively, this decision will effectively bankrupt the country and give more power to the IMF to impose its austerity measures and increase privatisation, and therefore increase greater power of the corporate sector. And I think that's really an important aspect. Our speakers have all provided information about the detail of these agreements. There's a lot more. I mean, they're so complex, but essentially, as Diyana said, these agreements in their entirety are written by corporations for their interests, and that is essentially sexist on its own. I mean, neoliberalism is sexist. Of course, some women benefit from these agreements, but they're those women who are already powerful within a neoliberal system. But in the main, trade agreements are dependent on the exploitation of lower wages, on the capacity to privatise the services that women need, on the capacity for foreign investors to buy land that women have been depending on, and for the capacity of foreign investors to override the potential for governments to regulate in the public interest. So, yeah, I think that understanding the broader context is really important to understanding the detail as well. Perhaps, so now if anybody would like to, I'm open to questions from those that have come on. For any of the panellists, any specific questions, but also any general questions that anybody would like to have, or areas that haven't been covered. Either flag it in the Q&A box or speak. And if not, I think I'm going to throw some questions myself to both the panellists and also to some of the people on the call. I think the last, we'll take questions, but the last part that we want to consider is also what can we do now, but I'll come to that in a moment. So would anybody like to ask a question or make a comment? And if you do, please unmute yourself.
Hi, Kate, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Ranja here from Third World Network, and thank you, Kate, for moderating this so well, and to all the four speakers. I think you guys covered like different aspects of RCEP and, in fact, trade agreements in general very well. So I had one quick comment about the dairy issue that Kate you mentioned, And it's interesting because dairy and the cooperative Amul, which is like the largest cooperative in India, and it's based on very small dairy farmers whose milk, they take and then they process some of it. And most of them are women. And what I wanted to say, so for India, dairy was a key issue, and Amul is the one they kept up, they kept up resisting. An interesting thing that I wanted everybody to know about is actually the women milk farmers who are part of this cooperative, because Amul is jointly owned by all of them, by the milk producers, and they sent thousands of postcards to the Prime Minister. So they did this massive campaign telling the Prime Minister how terrible it will be for very small women milk farmers, that that it is their livelihood, how they supplement their household income, how they depend on this income, and how opening up to RCEP would actually destroy women's contribution to the household and their key role in sustaining their families. So I think that was very important, something that I wanted to flag. And I had a question in general for maybe some of you to pick up, and to you also, Kate, is about the global value chains. Because one major reason that we have heard, in India, okay, let me show my face since I can. In India, one major reason that some of the industry bodies and even the government were using is that it will help, especially India, but also other countries, to integrate better into global value chains. And we know that for women's work, increasing exploitation of women workers, casualization, and informalization of work really has been driven through the global value chains, and the chains are actually controlled by very large corporations who sit with all the technology, and they actually, most of the value is kind of controlled by them. Most of the profits go to them. So I wanted to kind of ask whether any of you would really like to pick up the question about that whether for India it would be beneficial, but also for the other countries, because I think the rest of the countries other than India are already quite well integrated. So did you face this global value chain argument, that this global value chain will be developing much faster in the region because of RCEP, and that was supposed to be one of the key driving factors behind signing RCEP? And then what do you think of women's roles in the global value chains and that of women workers in particular in the global value chains?
Right, thanks Ranja. I think both for the context of the dairy cooperatives and also the question. Is there anyone that wants to comment on the question about this argument about global value chains? Anyone
I can take a go. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Anita.
So, Ranja, thanks for that question. And I think all of us feel identically about the rhetoric around, great opportunities at the end, the pot of gold after the rainbow in terms of integrating with all these, in a globalized market. I think it's quite important and noteworthy that the argument about the global value chains is coming back in a kind of a very, very aggressive way, especially from the standpoint of what I already mentioned in the EWTP and the stances that digital companies are taking, and in that, one important behind the scenes thing, which is not quite evident in trade negotiations, because we still tend to think of agriculture, manufacturing, and services as these distinct sectors. But what really is happening in the real economy is that the idea of global value chains is undergoing a rapid disruption. And therefore, you find fewer and fewer companies controlling value chains, including through vertical integration. So Google is not only, this is something you will have heard many times, from my colleagues and even otherwise from, scholars like Jane Kelsey. You actually have companies that started off, in online marketplaces, now manufacturing cars, And, Amazon, in one of our studies, we found that in the ports and logistics sector, India is a country with a very vast coastline. And in the ports, guess who is buying up the warehouses? Amazon. Amazon is buying up the warehouses, and Amazon also runs shipping liners. So you actually see this kind of concentration through digital power of an unprecedented kind of a way. And these global value chains are those that are being architected by digital corporations. What's very important to know in this is built precisely on the logic of casualization. You cannot have a digital, these are fly by night, and you're actually seeing Uber, the co-founders of Uber, just as we speak, in the past 16 hours, they are withdrawing and they are liquidating their stakes because Uber Eats is not doing very well in India. They are the kind of people who play in the financial markets just so that they can ride on top of precarity. So it's the backs of people, it's the kind of taking for granted of social reproduction, and it's a taking for granted of, public services and a decimation of public services, on top of which this kind of new global value chains based on a digitalized integration of the global economy is built. And casualization is a very, very important organizing principle of this. And someone actually said very poignantly, there is a feminization of even the work that men do, which is so poignant that everything about women's work used to be highly precarious and informal and unpaid. And what you're actually seeing is an extension of all of that to the economy in general.
Yeah, I think if I might comment also on the work that you've been covering, Anita, that I think it's really imperative that we better understand what's happening through both the e-commerce provisions of these trade chapters and in the WTO. And as you said, these major data companies are actually moving into all of the sectors that make so much of a difference to the real economy and also to public services. I mean, we've found that Amazon is has one of the largest procurement contracts globally for public services. Microsoft recently Microsoft is now the largest military contractor in the world. It has the largest military contract of any company. And so this is not just the traditional thought we have around what these companies are delivering. They are intervening in every aspect of public services and the real economy. And the provisions, I think, that Anita talked about before, the fact, that the even less capacity for governments to regulate those digital corporations, the fact that there's a protection against requiring local presence or disclosing algorithms. I mean, these are provisions that are beyond even our capacity to have, apart from a few people, to have kept up with the analysis. So it's really important that as feminists we have allies working in that area. I see also, I just wanted to also very quickly, Ranja mentioned about the work that has been done in India. And I think this is really important. There's other questions here I see coming up about how do we resist? And so that's a great case study actually of Amal and the groups in India that worked with them. But we may need allies that we didn't expect in small national enterprise and cooperatives like that case study. I also remember that India specifically raised concerns about the procurement chapter in a number of agreements. Of course, there's broad procurement chapters, and when that was raised in these negotiations, they specifically said that would undermine their capacity to direct procurement towards small women's micro enterprises and give, and ensure they can support those, those industries that are predominantly women. And so that was also, I think, an important intervention to show that there are stakes for women in these negotiations. Now I'll just go to a couple of questions here on the chat. So we have a question from New Caledonia about if New Caledonia becomes a independent country through its own referendum of self-determination, what are the consequences for the Pacific Islands, for any of, for, I guess, for the RCEP or other trade agreements? Would anybody like to try and answer that? It's a tough one.
I'll give it a shot. I think, I mean, thanks, Agnes, for your question. Of course, whether or not New Caledonia, when New Caledonia becomes self-determined next year, it is not currently a party of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, this particular agreement per se. But there are, of course, a lot of the things that we spoke about within the context of this agreement that are also applicable, as Ranja mentioned, to a lot of other trade agreements out there more broadly as well. I know in the Pacific, PACER Plus is, of course, one of the largest sort of like trade negotiation that's happening in the Pacific Islands. And while there are, fortunately, as far as I know from PACER Plus, there are some of the more detrimental aspects of the RCEP that are not in PACER Plus. I think PACER has a carve out or doesn't have an ISDS provision in it, which is great. And if I am not mistaken, it has also a couple of other more detrimental parts of the RCEP, which I can't remember off the top of my head inside the PACER Plus as well. However, I do think that some of the points that Kartini had raised, because PACER Plus is talking about the removal of a lot of tariff barriers of the Pacific Island countries. So most of the Pacific Island countries already have almost zero tariffs when it comes to sending products into Australia, for example. And so PACER Plus was really geared towards removing all the other tariff barriers among Pacific Island countries for basically Australian and I guess New Zealand product to be able to enter into Pacific Island countries. And I think those remain to be one of the things that I think when we talked about how both, number one, tariffs provides a huge source of resources for a lot of developing countries in terms of actually generating, public funds to then fund public goods and public services. And then there's also an aspect of how obviously once a lot of these tariffs are removed, you will see or a lot of small sellers, farmers, medium enterprises in these Pacific Islands having to compete with much, much more larger corporations coming from the more developed country in the PACER Plus negotiation. And we've seen in many of our side of the world when these happens, women, especially women farmers, women who are in subsistence farming, they tend to be the one who are first displaced when, when the local market has to suddenly face a lot of influx of goods from another foreign country. And then I also kind of just wanted to add on a little bit more on the RCEP point about how do we feel about this, I would say a temporary victory on the ISDS clause being temporarily removed from the RCEP negotiation or the RCEP text. And obviously it comes in a huge global political context. I don't think any government in the region and even, all the other bodies who make these trade rules and regime can dispute that there is a huge amount of criticism that has been pointed towards the ISDS mechanism for various reasons that I've mentioned and some that I was not able to cover, in fact. So those criticisms have really, really been picked up. But I think what we need to be more aware now is the responses towards those criticisms. So globally, there is a broader discussion in UNCTAD, in UNCITRAL, even in WTO and in various other spaces about what a reform or what would be a reform of the ISDS system as it currently is. And some of those conversations, there are some parts of those conversations where it talks about we should just remove ISDS completely, but they're like a small part of those conversations. But largely these bodies of powers, in contrary to a lot of the people's movement, are either talking about creating a more structured system, which is the EU's proposal for a multilateral investment court system, or some of defining more of these bilateral treaties that doesn't really provide a lot of definition for ISDS, so defining what investments are, defining what expropriations are, so like fine-tuning the details of the legal text And some of those newer treaties have like actually put that as well. And then of course there are also more broader conversation about bringing, you know, what the original form of ISDS was really about direct expropriation instead of everything, right? And I think generally most of these proposals are the responses of states and governments and WTO and UN agencies into what would be a genuine reform of ISDS has not really addressed much of the criticism that civil society and people's movement have put forth to it. So I think it's really important for us to make sure that the conversation around ISDS, so-called reform, doesn't just become a symptomatic fix to a system that is fundamentally flawed and would continue to fail in the way it is right now, and probably always will.
Great. Yeah, I think you might have just answered the last question that came in, which was about substituting an ISDS. I think it is important to note that the EU's proposal for a new system has been broadly critiqued as sort of a wolf in sheep's clothing, and the question about the sort of geopolitics of the ISDS, I think it's always important to remember that effectively what ISDS is saying that developing countries can't be trusted. You know, investors need protections that protect them beyond national legal systems. I mean, and it's extraordinary that that was ever accepted, and that narrative is, you know, still maintained. I might just quickly also add to your comment on the question from New Caledonia in a broad sense, is that the RCEP, I should have mentioned at the beginning in the introduction, is ASEAN +6 effectively. So that's, you know, ASEAN and its 6 major trading partners. But the intention is to broaden out to the free trade area of Asia Pacific. So it's always been the case. I mean, all of these, you know, neoliberal dreams are to impose these rules on all countries. And now the free trade area of Asia Pacific would be initially all the APEC countries, but of course countries are increasingly going to be isolated. That's one of the issues, is that all countries are impacted by these rules, whether they be in the agreement or not. There is continual pressure to come around to these rules. Even a country like Timor-Leste, just thinking about it, a fairly newly independent country, is applying now to join ASEAN. It hasn't been a member of the WTO. It would really have to alter all its rules. And when a country is new and independent, it needs the capacity to define its own development policies and support new industries and create a new both political and economic system. The Pacific Island countries, of course, have got unique challenges. As Diyana mentioned, the PESA Plus doesn't have all the provisions of these kind of agreements, but it does eliminate tariffs. And a country like Vanuatu had 20% of its government revenue from tariffs, because it's very difficult for countries with their unique, you know, issues of isolation, of having, you know, borders, water borders, to be able to manufacture and export. So they put tariffs, understandably, and they will lose a huge amount of revenue as a result of the PESA Plus. So I'm not expert at all on New Caledonia, but that could be the sort of implications that it could have. Okay, now I think there's also a general question around where we are. I mean, where is the political moment in the deep crisis that we have in the global trade disputes, particularly, of course, the US and China, but also, I guess, with, you know, the blocking of the WTO. I think we've all been strong critiques of the WTO, but now it's almost as if that's the lesser of two evils. So the question is, like, what are the new complications for us as civil society in that sense? Where do we align? What are the directions we need to take? And I think that's a really good question for us all for perhaps all the panelists to answer. Where should we go from here?
Can I just add on a question to Nandini's, because she's asking about how should, you know, civil society kind of act around this, this complication. So I also wanted to ask, what should women's rights groups do? Because in the WTO, in a way, the you know, the gender and trade issue has come in, we are trying to resist it. But here, do we kind of actually, because I have not really seen a case. I mean, I know APWLD and women's rights groups have done some work saying we resist RCEP because it will be bad for, you know, women in their different roles in general. But how do they then have kind of like the counter argument to the WTO? Because a lot of these governments are saying, you know, okay, we are so concerned about women because they want to liberalize more in the WTO. But can we say that, yeah, because this will be bad for women? Because I haven't heard that women as a constituency, that voice coming out. I mean, it has come out, but how do we make it stronger to say, if you are so concerned about the trade impacts on women, the way you are positioning yourselves at the WTO, and we are actually saying that RCEP will be bad, which is the reverse argument, and how do they kind of, you know, use that debate in the WTO to strengthen their positions vis-a-vis RCEP, critiquing RCEP?
Great. I think that, yeah, that complements the question well. So if the panelists would all like to give a shot at that sort of combined question. Maybe Kartini, would you like to start?
Sorry, I'm on mute, sorry. So yeah, sort of to looking into what the questions have been given so far, I think following up the global crisis in 2008, several new trade deals have been proposed actually to find place outside the frame of WTO, all these mega regionals. But I think it needs to be remembered that WTO have some of the ground base of those provisions. I think we need to be continue proactively challenging both WTO and the free trade agreements, especially this new sort of the new generations that's really talking very much on the policy space of countries and what they can do or not, and with the new economy are growing, including the platform economy, I think the challenges are bigger. Sometimes, for example, in the case of agriculture, farmers or rural community, they can't see anymore who they are facing. For example, the traditional land grabbing, for example, you know the company who are there and taking their land. But in the indirect ways of expropriating land through digital agriculture, for example, communities have like becoming very unsure what, you know, who are they facing, because it's not even presence. They don't know who owns it. You know, it's somewhere operating in other countries. So I think we need to be very, very strict and very strong in the arguments as well of this kind of trade agreements, and also the questions on global value chains are really linking on more further corporate integrations rather than, you know, the benefit of peoples and planet in this case. And so I think it's really, I find it's we need to find linkages more with other sectors to work together, and because this I think one of the biggest opportunity we have right now is try to link more between the trade movements and the climate movement, for example. And I think there are barriers there that we haven't really discussed, also because people think it's quite different, you know, the issue that, but no, if you look how the trade policies actually making it worse for people and the environment. I think we need to bring, you know, bigger movements come together, women's movements, trade movement. I think we need to stop working in silos, and sort of just to come together. As the questions are where we are at, actually, I think reflecting on the situations that the world we are living today. So I don't know. That's from my side. Thank you.
Yep. So bring. I mean, I think it's a good suggestion to look at the bigger movements, the climate and other movements. Ari, do you have any additions to what Kartini has said? She's still on mute. Ari, can you? No, maybe I'll move to Anita. Anita, do you have some comments about these big picture questions?
I think coming after Kartini, I mean, I was listening intently to her very wise words and thinking very, very much, how, that I couldn't agree more. I do think that there are a couple of things women care about very dearly. I think feminism is about the project of democracy and the project of nonviolence, right? And I think that the way in which these questions about the macroeconomic parameters that have shaped the 21st century, if we actually look at them, I think these very big questions around trade and justice, climate and justice, and now increasingly, the digital and justice, these are, I think, some of those unresolved and contested, highly contested issues. I think in respect of the example you gave, Kate, of a military future that's based on the killer switch, which will be operated by algorithms, I can only think that we need a kind of a new global democratic kind of framework. It's not really possible in the absence of a global electorate system to talk about a social contract that is global. I mean, that would certainly not be possible or plausible. But I think we need first for standards on this kind of a digital future to be defined globally, so that the rules that emanate in terms of trade, in terms of value chains, which have a deep impact on the way we look at nature as a resource that may be unlimited, freely exploitable, out there just for us to extract. These assumptions can actually be questioned, because data extractivism and the kind of destruction and extraction in nature are just two sides of the coin. It's all about those efficiency paradigms where we want to really consume more and more, and corporations want to reduce the time that it might take to deliver a product in such a way that ships with preloaded goods are just waiting in the Pacific and in the Atlantic, so that during Christmas, if you can order something online, you can, bring that gift home in less than 6 hours, So I think that we have to reinvent democracy. And I'm very sorry that, Ranja, I think I have a lot to learn from activists such as you, and I don't really have an easy answer. But I think with respect to data, we know what our struggles are with the national governments. And with respect to data, we know what our struggles are in the global political economy of trade, of intellectual property, of AI and patents. And therefore, if we do not really have a new human rights framework which redefines the role of the digital and data, we are really going to be very lost, because the future of corporate integration, consolidation, and statism, and Big Brother really surveilling human bodies, particularly women's bodies, is really about that contract. I don't mean to essentialize the data question, but this is something that I think is important for feminists to consider.
Anita, I mean, I have to say that, it is some of the most profound thinking and disturbing, but also challenging, is around reading this work that you and others have been doing to really understand how our global rules are being set through the new digital economies. And if there was one thing I would think about, is having a future webinar, maybe I can put this to Diyana when she responds, about to better explore this area. But I did want to maybe, before I hand over to Diyana, just say, I guess, that one way we can perhaps learn from what corporations have done, even though, as you said, we don't have a global system to set the rules, that they had the audacity to think that they could come together and set the rules through new agreements and have done that. I mean, it's extraordinary, really. Who would have thought? I certainly didn't, you know, even when I was studying law as a, you know, at university, had no idea that there was this system where where global corporations were setting up the rules. But we knew that there was a UN system. So I think, you know, part of we shouldn't think we're just thinking of fantasies. It is possible, but of course, a huge struggle. Anyway, I think it would be useful to get Diyana's input on this, you know, final question, but hope we can further that discussion in the future. Diyana?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how to add on top of what both Kartini as well as Anita has also mentioned. I mean, I think it's really ironic when looking back at Nandini's question, how, you know, I mean, there was a global financial and economic crisis, but I think it was also the strength of the people's movement that in many ways created the blockade at the WTO processes and has, you know, effectively led to this whole situation where people are constantly saying that the multilateral trade system is in crisis, right? And the multilateral trade system is in crisis, as we know, because it has failed. And any system that has failed and has not served any interest of the people probably does not deserve to exist anymore, and needs to be completely removed and replaced. But, you know, just kind of reflecting back that how our successes has also led to, you know, governments and corporations, you know, upping their games and taking this out into spaces that are much more less accessible. It breaks the movements, because previously we could all come together at the WTO space, but now, you know, you have the RCEP, and, you know, I'm so thrilled to have so many people on this webinar who are not from RCEP countries, but the reality is even the movements have been fragmented because of the way they fragmented all these trade agreements, and that has, you know, added to another layer of like the challenges when we talk about building and strengthening our people's movement and our socials movement. And so now we're stuck between like two evils. I wonder if one is lesser than the other sometimes, but we definitely have no doubt that we're stuck between two evils, and we're stuck between these two evils as we're also heading towards like a massive climate crisis, which is going to be which all of our efforts are going to be undermined, whether you talk about multilateral and plurilaterals like RCEP and TPP, and likewise with WTO, which continues to be, as Kartini said, the base of all the rules that we are facing now in RCEP and TPP, and continue to be making, you know, attempting to make new rules as well, which is of course going to continue and has been undermining any kind of efforts that we've been putting forth to sort of like put an, you know, challenge or battle the climate crisis that we're all heading to. So in a way, I think there's no other way to kind of look at it rather than like from a partial doomsday scenario, but also like the strength and the power of people's movement, because it's also really, it has become a question of survival, right? We can't continue to consume, the global value chain can't continue to operate the way it is, governments can't continue to be sued every time they try to introduce more, you know, energy friendly policies, you know, and or having domestic solar panel industry, you know, it really can't work in an era where we need to be doing more in terms of climate, in terms of the climate crisis. So there's a bit of like a survival. And then I think because we've shown that the successes both of the people's movement, of the power of people's movement in WTO, and then even when you reflect like the kind of anger that general ordinary people have, but then the response to it has been always to lean towards more right-wing, authoritarian, strongman type of government, thinking that they would give them the solution to the neoliberal crisis, which is what it also is, tells me that it's really, there's no other option other than for us to really just mobilize more and more cohesively and more strongly as progressive movements, while also at the same time navigating, you know, in context of many of these trade issues and neoliberal issue, like recognizing that some of the groups who actually share our position are also the right-wing fundamentalist group for very different reasons than what we have. So I don't know if I'm actually giving more answers or actually throwing more questions to everyone. But I think, you know, there's something that needs to be done in terms of bringing back a lot of these different movements together. And we do see that in very specific trade-related aspect that continues to happen in that the WTO, it continues to happen in a lot of ISDS-related things, some of the common things that exist across all the different trade agreements. And I think, you know, some of those successes, and every time I think we have successes, we like it's a one step forward, two step back, or maybe one step back. But I think that's also the nature of every kind of movement. And I think there's no other way for us other than to continue to strengthen that, as you know, as Kartini has also already mentioned.
Great. Okay, thank you. I think we've gone a little bit of overtime. I know that Ranja's question is still hanging a bit about how does the broader feminist movement then respond to what's happening, the instrumentalizing of women's rights in the WTO. And I mean, I think at least there was a good initiative to put on record what was the position of women's rights movements. And I think that's really important, even if we can't have large numbers there, to continually put on record that this is not something that's supported and it's clearly detrimental. And maybe this webinar, I mean, is one way that we can learn a bit more about how to do these things. So perhaps the kind of example that we had in the past where, you know, we hear at the WTO there's going to be this, you know, resolution, and we come together in a webinar, discuss, response, circulate, gives us at least the capacity that, you know, we might not have the funds to come together there, but at least have a capacity to join up and respond. And that I'm pretty sure they don't like. I mean, that was why that particular letter got a lot of attention. But anyway, I think that's, you know, we have to end on some positives, and there is the crisis that we face, I think, that we see globally is partly a response to the mobilisation of people's movements. Unfortunately, it's a cynical manipulation of the critique that's gone to further, you know, right-wing racist interests, but it is a sign that that the critique got through and matters. And we just have to find ways to position an alternative, and that's what we don't have yet. But that possibly is something for future work. So hopefully everybody who came on to the webinar, I think we had like 27, 28 people come on, and I think that's a really good first try for a topic that's not easy. And you know, I think that's thanks to the organisers, to APWLD and TWN for doing that. And I don't think this would have happened when we first started looking at this, right, Diyana, you know, whatever, 8 years ago would it be? I'm not sure, but when we first started campaigning on trade, I don't think we would have been able to get that many people from so many countries to come together. So that's a heartening sign. And hopefully we can do this again. And thanks to Diyana and to Ranja for including me and for organising. I think we can, I know that this is recorded, so if anybody would like to share the webinar, Diyana, contact you. Is that the best way?
Yes, we'll put it out on APWLD social media, so look out for it somewhere in our social media, probably a link to a YouTube video or something like that. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yes.
And you can join the Gender and Trade Coalition and find resources on that website.
Yes.
So thanks again to all our wonderful speakers, and hope we see each other again soon.
Yes, and thank you, Kate, for moderating.
Very welcome.